So the idea of my presentation is to present you what's happening in the first stage of the digital twin we are building. And I'm going to talk about the simulations of morphology formation in solution processed photovoltaics. So my name is Olivier Ronsin. I'm working at the the Helmholtz Institute for Renewable Energies in Erlangen-Nuremberg. And I belong to a theory group which is specialized on the dynamics of complex fluids and interfaces. And in my team, we are working on applying these techniques to the formation of photoactive layers in printed photovoltaics. So today, after a short introduction, I would like to show you some basics on the fundamental processes that are happening when we process our printed solar cells, namely demixing, crystallization most of the time, and evaporation, which is the process which is triggering the structuring of our layers. Then I'll show you some examples of application to printed photovoltaics. First, on thermal evolution of OPV bulk heterojunctions, thermal evolution relating to processing steps like thermal annealing, of course, but also to the aging of the solar cells afterwards. Then we'll have a look at the formation of bulk heterojunction upon drying. And then if I have some time, I will talk about perovskite films also. And then to finish with, I will show you some insights on the process structure performance relationships, which goes in the way of starting the explanation, how it connects to the next stages of the digital twin. So regarding the context, the objectives, this is quite simple. Our goal is to simulate how the processing and the operating conditions impact the cell morphology and first of all of the active layer. Either in the case of organic photovoltaics, where we have bulk heterojunctions, like the nice image you see here in 3 colors, which is a ternary bulk heterojunction, but also for perovskite solar cells, where the morphology is a little bit more simple, but nevertheless is a polycrystalline morphology. And the idea behind is to anticipate the best processing conditions, to have the best PCs, of course, and the best stability behavior. So the challenge thereby is that basically our inputs are material properties, of course, which we'll define a little bit later, and also the process parameter. And through the simulation of morphology formation, we want to know how the photoactive layer looks like, which means how many different phases do we have, what are their type, what are their amounts, and for each phases, how do the domain sizes look like, what's the topology, the composition, and in particular for perovskite, what is the film roughness, do I cover all my substrate, and so on. And to be able to model this, we think that we need to take into account a lot of physical processes actually, but summarizing to the 4 most important, we need to take into account solvent evaporation when we solution process the film. There will be a lot about liquid-liquid phase separation, crystallization, and also kinetic quenching, because we start with a fully liquid system and we end up at the end of the drying with a fully solid, which behaves much more slowly, of course. The simulation approach we use for that, Carsten already mentioned that, these are so-called phase field simulations, which are actually very well suited with this problem. Phase field, the name comes from phase transformation, actually, because the variables which were considered were initially variables which were related to the phase states, typically amorphous or crystalline. And a field, this is a field on a mesh, basically. So this is the only meaning of phase field. So that's not that complicated, actually. So what we do here, we have a modeling of phase transformations, which we encode in a free energy functional. And then we use kinetic equations to describe the kinetic evolution of the system towards its thermodynamic equilibrium. Knowing that in our case, in general, the thermodynamic equilibrium is never reached because the system is kinetically quenched before it reaches it. And it's very important to notice that it's a continuum mechanics approach, which is necessary if we want to handle the time and length scales we have in a problem. And thereby the many interfaces we'll have in the system are handled as diffuse interfaces, which is numerically much more easy than handling sharp interfaces. I want to show you a very nice example I like of a seminal paper by Olga Fodo 10 years ago, roughly, where she simulated for OPV system the drying of a bulk heterojunction actually from the top to the bottom. The film is drying, and you see how demixing is triggered upon evaporation, and then you have the formation of a co-continuous morphology. On the left, you have a slow drying, and if you dry faster, you see that the spinal decomposition rather tend to occur at the beginning, at the top of the film, and with a much more smaller pattern. Okay, so this was just to give you an overview, and now I would like to go to the basics of the fundamental processes, and we'll start with amorphous demixing, which is not the point for perovskite, but which is certainly very important for organic photovoltaics. So actually, in all these problems, we need to handle 4 major processes, which are related to 4 different kind of equations. The first one will be diffusive mass transport and demixing, which we'll describe with the so-called Cahn-Hilliard equation. Crystallization will describe this with a stochastic Allen-Cahn equation. The so-called will have a look in more detail. The evaporation will describe this with, once again, an Allen-Cahn equation and a Hertz-Knudsen description of the evaporation. And we'll also need fluid mechanics equations for effective mass transport. So but for the time being, let's talk about demixing and the Cahn-Hilliard equation. So I'll try to show you these equations. They are quite complicated. The point here is not to consider them in all details, but rather to see the general structure of the equation. So here, this is the so-called Cahn-Hilliard-Cook equation for diffusive mass transport, where you consider a variable phi, which describes the volume fraction of a material in a mixture. And actually, the kinetic equation is simply a generalized diffusion equation. In red, so for a multinary mixture, so for any number of materials in your mixture. In red, you have the driving force, which is here the gradient of the chemical exchange chemical potential. With a very simple diffusion equation we'll all learn in our studies, this would be the gradient of the concentration, but here it's generalized to the gradient of the chemical potential. In yellow, you have the mobility, so which will be related to the diffusion coefficients. And in blue, you have a stochastic term. So let's have a look at the driving force. The driving force, I told you, we encode a thermodynamic property into a free energy functional. So this is the free energy here. And here, this is made of a local part. This is the first term, and maybe some of you recognize here the Flory-Huggins free energy, which is made of an entropic mixing term and enthalpic interactions. And on top of this, we add a surface tension term, which will represent the effect of surface energies. So the chemical potentials are basically the functional derivatives of this free energy. And then we have the driving forces. For the mobility coefficients, I do not want to go into too much detail, but these lambda ij factors here have to respect some certain rules. But basically what I want to show here mainly is that they are related to the diffusion coefficients of the materials in the mixture. So here in this lambda ij, we have the diffusive properties of the mix, basically. And in blue, you have the thermal noise, which will trigger the mixing. So how does it look like then in practice? From the free energy, we can plot a phase diagram. So here it's a very simple example for a binary mixture where we see how the phase state depend on the composition on the x-axis and on the interaction parameter on the y-axis. So you have regions where the mix is stable. In the middle in red, it's unstable, and we'll have spinal decomposition here. And in between, you have metastable state where you will have phase separation by nucleation and growth. In practice, we can now simulate this system, and here you have an example of spinal decomposition. So the two plots shows the volume fractions of the two materials, let's say. And so we start from the homogeneous state, and it spontaneously demixes. And you see here the well-known picture of co-continuous structures. So this is spinal decomposition. I want to emphasize here that with spinal decomposition, you might have co-continuous structures or droplets. The point is that it's spontaneous demixing because the mix is unstable, but both morphologies are observable. Now, if you go to nucleation and growth, so in the blue region here of the phase diagrams, this will be a little bit different. You will have a phase separation mechanism by nucleation and growth of droplets. And in that case, you always have droplets. So a summary is spinal decomposition morphology that might be co-continuous or droplet-like. And for nucleation and growth, this is asynchronous demixing, and you always have droplets, basically. Okay, let's switch now to crystallization. So for crystallization, we describe this with a stochastic Alenkane equation. So the stochastic Alenkane equation looks like that. This is basically the same structure. Now we introduce a phase variable big phi, which represents the phase state of a material, of a single material. So phi is 0 if it's amorphous and 1 if it's crystalline, for instance. We have the driving force, which is again a functional derivative of the free energy. We are going to have a look at that. A mobility in front and thermal fluctuation terms. So the free energy for a single material K here is made of two parts. The first line here is basically, which describes basically the transition from the amorphous to the crystalline state. Without going into much detail, the function, depending on the order parameter, looks like this. At 0, you have the liquid state, you have an energy barrier in between, and at 1, you have the crystalline state, which is energetically more favorable here, and which is related to the crystallization property of the material, so typically the heat of fusion, the melting temperature, and so on. And on top of that, we have the surface tension terms. So the first one is surface tension of one crystal, and the second one stands for impingement of crystals together, of different crystals together, and will be related to the orientation mismatch at the grain boundaries using an additional phase field term theta, which marks the single crystals. So this is one equation per crystallizing material. Nucleation occurs thanks to the thermal fluctuations, and impingement and coarsening will have this with the impingement function. How does it look like in practice? So here, this is a simple simulation of a pure material. On the left, you have the order parameter. Blue is 0 at the beginning, everything is amorphous, and you have no crystals. And upon time, you see crystals appearing, nucleating, growing, impinging, and then coarsening. Okay, so this is the basic behavior. Then you can post-process this, and for instance, you can plot the time-dependent crystallinity here. And for different parameter sets, basically, you usually have this kind of S-shape behavior of the crystallinity, which we can model through a simple equation related to the model of Johnson-Mill-Avrami, which some of you might know. Okay, now let's go to evaporation. So basically, evaporation in our framework is already a coupled model between the Cahn-Hilliard equation and an additional Alenkane equation we need for evaporation. So this is a little bit more complicated. So we have the Cahn-Hilliard equation once again. It's the same as before. And we use an Alenkane equation for describing the phase state of the solvents here in that case with an order parameter 5 depth, which is 0 if it's liquid, and 1 if it's vapor this time. So now I would like to emphasize some points in the thermodynamic properties. So let's have a look at the free energy. So it becomes a little bit more complicated. Here, let's forget about what's in shaded. You already saw that, actually. And the only thing I want to highlight here is that we need now a description of the vapor with the free energy in the vapor, which is basically the free energy of an ideal gas mixture. And then to handle the vapor and the liquid, the condensed phase together, we just interpolate between the properties of the condensed phase and the properties of the vapor. And then come surface tension terms. For the mobilities, basically it's the same. We interpolate the mobilities between the ones of the condensed phase and the one of the vapors, which are much higher, of course, since we're in a gas. Most importantly, when we do this kind of simulations, typically the setup is that we have a description of the vapor in the box. So we have both the liquid film, the vapor in between, the liquid vapor and interface between both. Why we do that is, the reason is that we know that, for instance, for perovskite, we have very deformable liquid vapor interfaces leading to rough or pinhole or rough films or films with pinholes, and we need this description of the liquid vapor interface. And now, how do we trigger evaporation? We just extract solvents from the box with a boundary condition at the top of the box, which looks like the equation here. And without going into much details, this equation corresponds to the Hertz-Knudsen theory of evaporation rate, which has proven to be nicely representing experimental results, even if not fully perfect. But basically, we have here the properties of the solvent, mainly the vapor pressure, the pressure in the environment is also important, of course, and the chemical potential of the mixture, which will drive the evaporation rate also. How does it look like in practice here? If we make a 1D simulation of drying of a simple mixture where I only have one solute and one solvent, this looks like this. On the left, you have the volume fraction of the solute. So the x-axis, this is the film height typically, and you see that you start here with a 10% solute. And with increasing time from blue to red, the film height decreases, of course, and the solute volume fraction increases up to 1. And on the right, you have the solvent volume fraction, which of course decreases over time. So this is how a single simulation looks like. Now, what you can do with that is that you can calculate the time-dependent film height and so the evaporation rate. And you can compare that with a simple, with the Hertz-Knudsen theory. Actually, you don't need phase field to resolve this problem. You can do that in a way like Uli Petzol did that with Simon Ternes, and compare if the simulation matches, the phase field simulation matches the results of a much more simple problem. And so here we plotted the evaporation rate over time because it's time dependent for different properties of the mixture. The most simple one is the black curve, which for which you can have an analytical equation actually, but for the other one you have to solve this numerically. And you see that depending on the interaction of your solvent with your solute, you might have a evaporation rate, for instance, that might be more or less constant at the beginning. Then you can compare that with experiments. So these are results of comparison for a PS toluene mixture, where you see here, so the dotted curves are simulation results in that case, and the full curves are experimental results for different initial volume fraction, and you see a beautiful match. What I want to highlight here is that this case is a little bit more complicated because actually we have a skin effect here, which means that due to the presence of the polymer, we have a skin of polymer which is building up at the top of the film. Okay, so these were some basics on the most important processes that we need to simulate the morphology evolution are for photoactive layers. Now I wanted to give you some insights into very practical cases. And let's start with thermal evolution of bulk heterojunction for organic photovoltaics. So the good point on thermal evolution is that we do not need evaporation, we do not need solvents. So we need mainly a Cahn-Hilliard equation to describe diffusive transport in a mixture, in a donor-acceptor mixture. And we need a stochastical N-kind because these materials are in general crystalline. So let's have a look at the equations we need. Here the point is that we need a thermodynamic and kinetic coupling between both equations, between the Cahn-Hilliard equation and the Allen-Cahn equation for the crystallization. So don't worry, the equation starts to look horrible. So this is the free energy function of the system. Don't panic, you've seen already most of the things. What I just want to highlight here is the coupling in gray. So the first line, this is the free energy of crystallization, and now it's going to depend on the blend composition, of course. The more you have of the crystallizing material, the stronger is the free energy of gain upon crystallization. And the two terms here are interaction terms, like in the Flory-Huggins free energy, but in the crystalline parts, because the interaction there and the crystalline state might be different as compared to the amorphous state. The mobility coefficient in the Cahn-Hilliard equations, here again, I just want to emphasize that they become order parameter dependent. Of course, your diffusion coefficients are now much lower in general in crystals as compared to the amorphous phase. And in the Allen-Cahn equation, the mobility coefficient, which fixes basically the crystallization rates, here also becomes dependent on the diffusivities in the materials. Now, having this couple set of equations, we can work. And here I want to show you an example of a comparison of phase field simulations with a real case. So here what you see are TEM pictures of small molecule fullerene bulk heterojunctions. So as usual, these TEM pictures are not perfect, but nevertheless, I don't know if you can see that on your screen, but this is a thermal annealing at different temperatures for a given time. And the higher the temperature, the larger you see these black domains, which are actually leaf-shaped small molecule donor crystals. Here you have the phase field reproduction of this. So this is 2D, whereas the TEM picture is somewhat 3D because, of course, the TEM is not infinitely thin, the TEM sample. But basically, you see that we can reproduce this pattern globally. And here I give you the example of 150 degrees, how it looks like depending on time in the phase field simulation. This is the starting point, and over time you see crystals that disappear, and then the remaining crystals that grow. Actually, after some work, it turned out that this was the mechanisms which could best explain what's happening in this particular mixture. So basically what's happening is that when you increase the temperature, the crystals that were here at the beginning become unstable and they dissolve. And then the remaining crystals simply grow with anisotropic growth because they are anisotropic. And that's as simple as that in that case. Okay. Then another example, which is much more tricky with much more complex mechanisms, actually. So here, these are SEM pictures of a PCE11 PCBM blend. This is an older blend, but what's interesting for this blend is that it has a strong burning degradation at the beginning of the life of a solar cell. And so therefore it was investigated. And people in the Giti phrase group in Israel, they imaged this photoactive layer with a VPI technique, which allows to see nicely the difference between the PCBM domains and the donor domains. Here, what you can see, so here the film is here, and you see some gray regions, which are actually amorphous PCBM domains. After some annealing time, they grow and they become purer. After 12 minutes of annealing, then you see PCBM crystals. Actually, these roundish things are crystals, which at some point carry on growing. They impinge. And in the other phase, you have no PCBM anymore. It has become PCE11. Actually, you have no phase separation in the amorphous phase. So we try to reproduce this with our phase field simulations. And here you see on the left the volume fraction of the PCBM, and so the blue points you see are PC11 nanocrystals actually, and otherwise you have an amorphous mixture of PC11 and PCBM in green. And on the right you have the other parameters, so we are tracking the crystallinity of PCBM. So let's run. You have a phase separation, some coarsening. After some point, you have crystals appearing, and then the phase separation in the amorphous phase vanishes. And you see that the shape of the crystals are this kind of beautiful roundish but rough shape somehow, which perfectly matches the observations. So from these simulations, what we can conclude, how we reach these morphologies, actually, there are a lot of ingredients, actually. The first thing happening is amorphous demixing. Then, as in always in amorphous demixing, you have domain purification in the amorphous phase. And then it triggers the crystallization because you have high content of PCBM phases, and in these phases the crystallization is more likely, and there you have PCBM crystallization. The crystallization is quite growth dominated, which means that you do not have a lot of crystals basically, and most importantly you have crystals that become much larger than the amorphous phase they grew from. And growing crystals of PCBM at some point impinge with the PC11 crystals, and that's the reason for this rough surface. But the PC11 crystals dissolve at some point because of surface tension effects, and this is why the PCBM crystals, however, grow roughly roundish. So you see, this is a much more complex situation as compared to the first one. And all this is depending on the materials parameters, and you have to perfectly know them if you really want to properly describe the reality. Let's switch now to the formation of OPV bulk heterojunction upon drying. So here we need the three equations we already talked about, the Cahn-Hilliard equations for a diffusive mass transport, the stochastic Allen-Cahn equation for crystallization, the Allen-Cahn equation for evaporation, but also we need fluid mechanics to represent advective mass transport. So the model in a nutshell, quickly, a summary, we have the Allen-Cahn equation, the Cahn-Hilliard-Cook equation, sorry, as you saw it before, but now we have an advection term, so it's became a diffusion advection equation, the advection term in green. You also introduce an advection term in the crystallization equation, in the evaporation equation. And how do you get these velocity fields you need for that? Actually, you need to solve the fluid mechanics equations. We solve them in an incompressible Stokes context with variable viscosities, and the most important point here is that we have capillary forces generating the flows, and these capillary forces, they depend from the phase field, so from the composition and of the other parameters. So you have a two-way coupling between the fluid mechanics and the phase field equations. How does it look like now? Here I wanted to show you an example of drying of a mixture. This is an old system, P3HT, PCBM, DCB. I won't show you PM6Y6 today, unfortunately, but simulations look like this. Basically, here it's a cross-section of a drying film. You have a lot of solvent in blue at the beginning, and upon drying, you see a phase separation appearing. And at the end, you have kind of something which probably looks like a real bulk heterojunction, hopefully. So I will stop at some point to describe different things. So you have solvent drying. And at some point, you see red dots appearing. These are P3HT crystals, actually. A little bit later, you see these very green regions appearing here. These are nearly pure PCBM phases, which appear through amorphous demixing in the amorphous phase, actually. And then you remove solvent, everything purifies, and at the end, you have green amorphous PCBM phases, red crystalline P3HT phases, and in brownish, you have an amorphous mixed phase, actually. You can extract some signals from these simulations, which you can compare with experiments. So here I will describe this because we have the equivalent measurements. So here in blue, you have the drying curve, so the time-dependent film height, which you can compare with this signal here and looks quite similar. The green curve here is what you would get for scattering experiments, which you have here in green on the left. And the black and red curves are respectively the average crystal radius and the average crystallinity, which you can measure by gigawatts. And here we have a beautiful match between experiments and simulations. Of course, the idea is to do that for different conditions and mostly processing conditions, of course. So we could see what's happening on this morphology for different drying rates, for instance. But we can also vary the material parameters, checking what happens, for instance, is if the acceptor crystallizes faster, if the mixture is less miscible or more miscible or whatever of interest. And now, so this means we are able to generate morphologies to understand how the morphology changes with processing and material parameters. I will go maybe very quickly regarding the time on the formation of perovskite films upon drying. And then I spent a very short word on process structure performance relationship. So here, this example is about the film quality and the impact of the drying rate, mainly on perovskite film crystallization. So here we model cross-section of drying films, which are where we want to investigate perovskite crystallization. And this looks like this, for instance. So here in red, you see the perovskite crystals appearing in a drying solution. So in this first condition, we investigate a thin film and we dry quite slowly. And you see that the perovskite film at the end is ugly. It's rough, you have pinholes. This is what you want to avoid. So the people working on perovskite know that if you dry faster, this generally improves things. And this we can nicely reproduce with the simulation. Actually, we have smoother film, no pinholes, and so on. The experimental reproduction of this looks like this, so exactly the same, basically. Now we want to switch to thick films. Imagine your back electrode is not reflective, you will need thicker films. And if you apply your usual fast-drying recipe, well, it's not perfect, actually. You see in the simulation, you have some regions where it's not crystallized, it's full of solvent, and this will generate pinholes below the surface, actually. And if you check that experimentally, yes, it's true, you have pinholes below at the substrate, and you do not want that. So our experimental colleagues had the idea to introduce seeds at the substrate to favor crystallization from the substrate, which of course improves things. This is already much better and experimentally as well. But here you see you still have a lot of crystals. This is not fully smooth. You have interfaces between vertical stacking of the crystals. And so we suggested them, yeah, maybe this time in this situation, you should dry slowly. Because when you dry slowly, our simulation says that you would get only growth from the seeds and a beautiful morphology. They did this, and actually, yes, this is exactly the morphologies they get. So the message here is that on our perovskite studies, we have a very nice match between simulation and experiments. I don't want to spend some time on this, but we quite nicely understand the formation mechanisms and the origin of the roughness of the pinholes. And at the end, generally, let's say this is all about a balance between nucleation, growth, and evaporation. And this is what fixes the morphologies. And actually, we think this is independent of the material system, meaning independent of the perovskite type. So to finish very quickly, to have an outlook towards the next presentation, I wanted to show you how we imagine the process structure performance relationships from these phase field simulations. So we have these phase field simulations, and this means that we have morphology raw data, as I showed you before. Now, of course, we want to know at the end how the performance of the solar cells depend on this morphology, and we need to work a little bit more for that. So the first thing we can do in a simple way is using this morphology raw data to extract some simple descriptors. So typically, how much amorphous phase of donor or of acceptor do I have? How much of crystalline phases of both? And if you're able to spectrally mold this, you might have optical properties depending on your morphologies. This is the first point. And of course, behind you will have the light absorption properties. On the other hand, for other descriptors other properties that might be morphology dependent, we need to work a little bit more using graph analysis tool. And if we do that, we can have descriptors for exciton dissociation, for instance. Not only that, but also for non-geminate recombination and for mobilities. And all these parameters, this is what we need to feed optoelectrical simulations behind, so typically a transfer matrix algorithm or grid diffusion simulations. Of course, here in the digital grid twin, in the next presentation, Carsten will show you how instead of spectrally modeling the optical properties, we can do that in a much proper way from first principle simulations. And to finish with, I wanted to show you an example of all this workflow we have performed on the bulk heterojunction morphologies I've shown you before, and how it looks like at the end. Without going into too much detail, we let all this workflow run, and we calculated JV curves with a simple grid diffusion model for different bulk heterojunction morphologies. Without going into detail, they are called 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 here. And we had time series of these morphologies, and we have JV curves for the different morphologies as cast or after thermal annealing or even after aging. And so if we just focus on the let's say on the black one, because we have the as cast curve here, which has an ugly fill factor here. If you thermally anneal, your fill factor is much increased, so you have a beneficial impact of the thermal annealing. And then afterwards, if you aged it, then you lose in GSC for this morphology, and that's not that good. Okay, so that's the target at the end, to have such JV curves depending on the morphology. To summarize, here we have a phase field framework for morphology formation of printed PV. We have first successful simulations of information. This includes diverse physics. This includes material and mixture properties, which is the most important to optimize our solar cells, and of processing steps in order to optimize our fabrication processes. Yes, and we are still working on the more modern OPV materials. I showed a lot with fullerenes today, but we are working on NFAs now. We are working on other perovskites. And the idea is at the end is to obtain design rules for process scale-up, most importantly. And of course, we want to work more and more, in particular in this digital twin project, to go towards process structure property relationships.